Summer in Willow Creek had that lazy, suffocating heat that made people want to stay inside. Grace Harper, a 32-year-old freelancer who worked from home, was used to the slow rhythm of the town. But that July, everything turned upside down. A serious electrical problem in her home, a charming old colonial-style house, had left her without power. The heat was unbearable, and the lack of electricity made working or even sleeping impossible. The local electrician said it would take days to fix. Grace needed a quick solution. Working was essential, and staying there without internet or air conditioning was not an option. After scouring the few options available on a short-term rental app, she found a secluded cabin on the outskirts of Ravenwood, a tiny village hidden among the hills and surrounded by dense forests. The price was reasonable, though the location felt uncomfortably isolated. The listing description was straightforward: cozy and private cabin, ideal for those seeking tranquility. Grace hesitated. Ravenwood had a reputation for being odd, full of local stories about sightings and eccentric residents, but exhaustion and desperation won out. She clicked Book Now and began packing her things. Driving there was already a challenge. The roads were narrow, covered by trees that formed a dark tunnel even at midday. There was no cell signal, which only made Grace more anxious. When she finally arrived, the cabin looked quaint, though a bit more worn than in the photos. The porch creaked, and the windows were slightly dusty. She let out a long sigh, thinking it would only be for a few days. Inside, the cabin was functional. There was a worn sofa, a small wooden table, and a basic kitchen. Everything seemed clean enough, though the air had that musty smell of a place left closed for too long. Despite that, the view from the living room window was enchanting. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, with trees gently swaying in the wind. After unpacking her bags and setting up her workspace, Grace felt exhaustion take over. She went to the bedroom, which had a simple wooden bed with sheets that smelled of cheap fabric softener. Without much thought, she collapsed and fell asleep almost immediately. Outside, the wind howled, and tree branches tapped against the windows. In the distance, a peculiar sound, almost like a whistle, echoed. Grace was too tired to notice. Little did she know her arrival had already caught the attention of something or someone. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Grace woke up. She still felt tired but had work to do. After a quick cup of coffee, she set up her laptop on the small table in the living room and began responding to emails and catching up on her projects. The calmness of the surroundings was comforting, but at the same time, the isolation gave her an uneasy feeling. Around 10 o'clock, while reviewing a spreadsheet, Grace heard a knock at the door. It wasn't aggressive, but firm enough to catch her attention. She froze for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Who could it be? The cabin was secluded, and the Airbnb host hadn't mentioned that anyone might stop by. Grace stood slowly and walked to the door, peeking through the small window beside it. Outside stood a man. He looked to be in his 30s, with short, disheveled hair and tattoos covering his arms. He wore a worn-out t-shirt and jeans, and his eyes scanned the area around the cabin as if searching for something. She hesitated, considering her options. This wasn't her home, and opening the door to a stranger seemed like a bad idea. Still, the man looked casual, maybe even harmless. Maybe he's from the village or a worker in the area, she thought. "Who is it?" she asked through the door, trying to keep her voice steady without opening it. The man turned his head toward the window, noticing her presence. A small, almost friendly smile appeared on his face. "I'm from nearby. Just came to see who rented the cabin. Most people avoid this place, you know." A chill ran down Grace's spine. Something about his tone, a mix of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite place, felt off. She decided not to respond. Instead, she walked back to the table and sat down, pretending he wasn't there. After a few minutes, the man seemed to give up and walked away. Still, she couldn't relax. No matter how hard she tried to focus on her work, she kept wondering who the man was and why he was there. She thought about messaging the host, but the cell signal was almost non-existent, and the cabin's Wi-Fi was barely functioning. The day dragged on, and Grace managed to focus just enough to complete her tasks. As the sun began to set, she ventured out to pick up something to eat in the small town. The village was eerily quiet, with only a few shops and a modest market. The locals watched her with curious eyes but said nothing. Back at the cabin, night had fallen. Grace prepared a quick meal and settled on the sofa, hoping to unwind. Just as she started eating, another knock came at the door. This time it was louder. She froze, the plate trembling in her hands. She got up slowly and walked to the door, peeking through the window again. It was the same man. He seemed more impatient now, his fists clenched at his sides. Grace backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She didn't know what he wanted, but decided to ignore him once more. She returned to the sofa, pretending he wasn't there. The knocking continued for a few more moments before stopping. The silence returned, but the unease didn't leave her. She double-checked all the doors and windows, locking them tightly. She even checked the back door twice before trying to sleep. Outside, the forest seemed more alive, with the branches of the trees swaying as though someone or something was moving them. When she finally turned off the lights and lay in bed, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't knocking this time. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Grace spent the entire night tossing and turning in bed. The sound of footsteps around the cabin had stopped, but the feeling that someone or something was nearby lingered. The wind outside howled, and the shadows of the trees danced across the windows like they were trying to creep inside. When the first light of dawn broke, she finally mustered the courage to get out of bed. She was exhausted, and it showed on her face. She needed coffee and a distraction, anything to push away the memory of the footsteps from the night before. After making a strong cup of coffee, Grace cautiously opened the front door. She wanted to check if anything seemed out of place. Daylight made everything less intimidating, but the uneasiness lingered. That's when she noticed something peculiar, marks on the dirt ground just outside the cabin. Footprints. Large and deep, they started at the edge of the porch and trailed around the side of the cabin. Grace followed them with her eyes, her heart pounding. The tracks circled the house and disappeared into the forest. There was something about their size that unsettled her. They were a little too big to be normal. A knot formed in her stomach, but she tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was the same man who had knocked on her door the day before. Maybe he'd walked around the house before leaving. But why would he do that? And what was he looking for? She went back inside and locked the door, trying to convince herself it was nothing. The work waiting for her was a good way to distract her thoughts, so she turned on her laptop and dove into emails and spreadsheets. Yet the feeling of being watched never left her. Every small shadow she caught in her peripheral vision, or the slightest creak of the cabin's old wood, made her jump. By the afternoon, the weather seemed to shift. Grey clouds rolled in, and the gentle breeze turned into a strong wind that shook the windows. The Wi-Fi, already unreliable, stopped working entirely. Frustrated, Grace sighed and decided she needed a break. Just a little fresh air, she murmured to herself, grabbing her coat and stepping out onto the porch. The forest seemed denser under the cloudy sky. Grace leaned against the porch railing, staring out into the endless stretch of trees. That's when she saw it, something that made her freeze. In the distance, among the trees, stood a figure. It was impossible to make out any details, but she was sure it was someone. The figure remained motionless, watching the cabin. Grace stayed there, staring, her heart pounding. The figure took a step back and disappeared into the shadows. She rushed back inside, locking the door behind her with trembling hands. Her mind raced. It had to be the same man from before. But why was he standing there, watching from the forest? Did he know she had seen him? Later, as she tried to focus on work, a noise made her freeze. It wasn't a knock this time. It was a scratching sound, as if something or someone was dragging against the side of the cabin. The noise was soft but persistent, coming from the far side of the house. Grace stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and crept to the nearest window. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. There was nothing there, yet the scratching continued. She decided not to investigate further. If something or someone was out there, she didn't want to find out. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving Grace in oppressive silence. She sat back down on the couch, hugging her knees, trying to convince herself that everything was just a coincidence. But then, a terrifying thought crossed her mind. What if it wasn't? As night fell again, Grace noticed something that made her blood run cold. The back door, which she had checked and locked the previous night, was slightly open. Grace froze when she saw the back door ajar. A chill ran down her spine, rooting her in place. She was certain she had locked it the night before. She had checked it at least twice before going to bed. The realization that something was wrong was impossible to ignore now. Summoning what little courage she had left, she crept toward the door, her steps hesitant. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet, echoing in the stillness of the cabin. When she reached the door, she slowly pushed it shut until it clicked, then turned the key to lock it again. Secure. But the air around her felt heavier, as if something unseen was watching her. Grace grabbed her phone and tried once again to call the cabin's host, but the signal was still non-existent. The Wi-Fi had been out since the morning, and she felt completely cut off from the outside world. For a fleeting moment, she considered leaving the cabin and driving back to town. But the thought of navigating the deserted road at night terrified her even more. Trying to convince herself there was a logical explanation, she returned to the living room. Maybe she hadn't locked the door as securely as she thought. Maybe the wind had blown it open. Maybe, but her mind kept returning to the footprints she'd seen earlier, the scratching at the walls, and the figure in the woods. None of it felt coincidental. With no other options, she decided to distract herself. She opened her laptop and started watching a movie she'd downloaded. The bluish light from the screen was the only source of illumination in the darkened room. For a moment, she was almost able to lose herself in the plot. But then, she heard it again. A noise from upstairs. This time, it was a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. The cabin wasn't big, but it did have a small attic that she hadn't explored. Her heart raced as she considered the possibility that someone might be up there. Maybe an animal had gotten in, or maybe... No, she didn't want to finish that thought. "Don't be ridiculous, Grace. There's no one here," she whispered to herself, gripping the arm of the couch. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen, she moved toward the stairs. Each step creaked loudly, the sound amplified in the silent house. At the top, she paused in front of the attic door. It was a simple wooden door, old and worn, and it was slightly ajar. Her breath caught in her throat. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door open, shining the flashlight into the attic. The space was small and dusty, filled with cobwebs and a few old boxes. At first glance, it seemed empty, but then she saw them. Footprints. Small, dirty marks on the wooden floor, leading from the far corner of the attic to the door where she now stood. Her blood ran cold. "No, no, no," she whispered, backing away. Before she could react further, a sudden noise erupted from downstairs. It was loud and sharp, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Grace froze, her mind racing. Something, or someone, was inside the cabin. She turned off the flashlight and tiptoed back down the stairs, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. When she reached the bottom, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The front door, which she had locked earlier, was wide open. The cold night air poured into the room, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the forest. And then she saw him. Standing just outside the open door, bathed in the faint light of the moon, was the tattooed man. He was staring directly at her. His face wore a small smile, but his eyes were wide and unblinking. Something about him seemed off, like he was both amused and angry. Grace didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She clutched the flashlight tightly, as if it could offer some form of protection. After what felt like an eternity, the man stepped forward. But before he could cross the threshold, Grace turned and bolted for the kitchen. Her hand found the drawer, and she pulled out a knife, gripping it with trembling fingers. When she turned back toward the door, the man was gone. The door was still open, the wind blowing the curtains softly, but there was no sign of him. Grace didn't know whether to feel relief or terror. She closed and locked the door again, double-checking it this time, then leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Grace felt her legs give way as she leaned against the locked door. The man had disappeared as quickly as he had appeared, but his presence seemed to linger in the air of the cabin. She knew she had to make a decision, flee or face whatever was happening. The thought of crossing the dark forest to reach the town was terrifying, but staying there felt like an even worse sentence. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight. The cabin was engulfed in dense silence, interrupted only by the sound of the wind outside. The knife she held in her hand trembled slightly, and her heart was still pounding like a drum in her chest. She decided she couldn't stay there without a plan. Grabbing her phone, even knowing there was no signal, she quickly climbed up to the attic. It was the only place where she might hide if things got worse. The space was cramped and stuffy, but it offered a partial view of the floor below through small cracks in the wooden planks. As she adjusted her position in the attic, she heard a sound coming from the kitchen. It was a soft creak, as if something or someone had moved an object. Grace held her breath, leaning forward to try to see what was happening downstairs. The moonlight filtered through the windows, faintly illuminating the kitchen, and then she saw him. The man was there again, standing by the sink. He didn't seem to be looking for anything specific. He just stood there, motionless, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Suddenly, he turned his head abruptly, looking directly at the attic. Grace shrank back, her heart nearly stopping. He couldn't see her, but he seemed to know exactly where she was. Slowly, the man began walking toward the stairs. Each step was deliberate, the sound of his boots echoing on the wooden floor. She braced herself for the worst. The knife was still in her hand, but Grace knew she was no match for him. When the sound of his steps reached the base of the staircase, something unexpected happened. Another noise, a deep, resonant sound came from outside the cabin. It was like a howl, but strange, almost human. The man froze. For a moment he stood still, as if trying to identify the source of the sound. Then, without warning, he ran out of the cabin. Grace heard the front door open and his footsteps disappear into the night. Still trembling, she waited a few minutes before moving. What was that sound? Was it coming from another person? Or something else? Carefully, she climbed down from the attic and approached the living room window. Outside, everything seemed calm, but the forest looked darker than ever. As she tried to decide what to do, another sound filled the air. It was similar to the first, but closer, almost at the front door. Grace stepped back, swallowing hard. It couldn't be the man returning so quickly. There was something else out there. Something she couldn't explain. Suddenly, the door handle began to turn slowly. Grace felt panic overwhelm her. She gripped the knife tighter, her eyes fixed on the door. But just like before, the sound stopped. The door didn't open. Everything fell silent. For a moment, Grace thought she might be losing her mind, that isolation and fear were playing tricks on her. But when she turned to grab her keys and leave, she noticed something on the living room table that hadn't been there before. A small piece of paper. With trembling hands, she picked up the note. There was only one sentence written, in shaky and hurried letters. "You shouldn't be here." Grace let the paper fall, terror swelling inside her. Who had left it, the man or something even more sinister? She only knew one thing. She had to leave. But how? The forest seemed to hide more than just trees that night. The note slipped from her hands, landing on the floor like a lead weight. Grace stepped back, gasping for air. The words hammered in her mind. "You shouldn't be here." Who had written it? The tattooed man? Or something worse? Questions spun in her head, but she knew there was no time for answers. Staying there meant putting herself in even greater danger. She grabbed her keys and flashlight, shoving them into her jacket pocket. The knife was still in her hand, though it felt like a useless piece of metal against whatever she was facing. Determined, she ran to the back door, locking it behind her, as if it could delay whoever or whatever was inside the cabin. Outside, the night was cold and damp. The forest, which during the day had seemed a tranquil landscape, now loomed as an oppressive maze. The wind swayed the tree branches, and the sound echoed like whispers all around her. Grace started walking quickly, trying to follow the dirt path that led to the main road. But the darkness was absolute, and the flashlight seemed to illuminate only the vast emptiness ahead. As she walked, the noises of the forest grew louder, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the sound of something heavy moving not far off. Grace tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just animals, maybe deer or foxes. But the farther she went, the more the sound seemed to follow her, synchronized with her own steps. After a few minutes, a new sound emerged. It was the same howl she had heard earlier, but now it was much closer. The sound was deep and reverberated in her chest, as if the forest itself was screaming. Grace froze, her heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Continuing along the path made her feel vulnerable, but going back to the cabin was out of the question. "Think, Grace, think," she whispered to herself, gripping the knife tightly. She decided to leave the trail, venturing into the trees. The roots and undergrowth made walking difficult, but she preferred the chaos of the forest to the predictability of an open path. The flashlight swung in her hand, casting shadows that seemed to shift with every step. She moved cautiously, trying to make as little noise as possible. After a few minutes, Grace stopped to catch her breath. She leaned against a large tree, straining to listen. The silence that followed was almost worse than the previous sounds. Everything seemed to have stopped. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her freeze. Between the trees, a figure stood motionless. It wasn't the tattooed man. It was something larger, taller. The flashlight caught only a glimpse. Long arms, almost disproportionate, and eyes that glowed like an animal's under car headlights. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. Whatever it was, it took a step forward. The ground groaned under its weight, the sound echoing like thunder. Grace didn't think twice. She started running as fast as she could, not caring about the direction. The forest seemed to close in around her, branches scratching her face and hands as she pushed forward. The sound of heavy footsteps pursued her. They were fast, faster than she was. Every time she glanced back, she saw only shadows. But the certainty that she was being chased was overwhelming. She tripped on a root and fell, the knife slipping from her hand and the flashlight going out on impact. Panic consumed her. Grace fumbled on the ground until she found the flashlight and turned it back on. When she illuminated what lay ahead, the air left her lungs. Just a few meters away, the figure stood still. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its form looked even more grotesque in the dim light. With a scream, Grace got up and ran again, ignoring the pain in her legs and the burning in her lungs. She didn't know how long she ran or where she was headed. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, that stopping meant being caught. Finally, after what felt like hours, she saw a distant light between the trees. It was faint, but seemed different from the shadows around her. Grace summoned all her remaining strength and ran toward the light. When she reached it, she saw it was a small lamppost marking the start of a dirt road. The road! She had found her way. But before she could catch her breath, she heard the howl again, closer, more ferocious. Grace knew she wasn't safe yet. She gripped the knife, panting, and looked around, bracing herself for the next move. Grace stumbled onto the dirt road, her body heavy and exhausted. The light from the small lamppost swayed gently in the wind, casting dancing shadows along the trail. The sensation of being so close to safety, yet still far enough to be in danger, was almost unbearable. The howl echoed again, now coming from two different directions. She turned her head, trying to pinpoint the source, but the forest around her seemed alive, full of movements she couldn't see clearly. Grace gripped the knife tightly, as if that piece of metal could somehow protect her from whatever was hunting her. She started walking down the road, her steps quick and unsteady. The gravel crunched beneath her feet, the sound louder than it should have been. Every few steps, she glanced over her shoulder, expecting that grotesque figure to emerge from the trees at any moment. But there was nothing, only the sound of her own footsteps, and the distant howls. Grace tried to recall the direction that would lead back to town. The road had no signs, and everything around her looked the same. Endless trees, oppressive darkness, and the biting cold of the night that seeped into her bone. Fear crept into her mind. Was she going the right way? What if she was moving even farther from safety? As she walked, a different sound reached her ears, something dragging across the gravel behind her. She stopped abruptly, her heart racing, and turned around, shining her flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness but revealed nothing but the empty road. Still, she was certain she wasn't alone. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. No response, just the sound of the wind in the trees. She took a step back, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Then she saw it. Something moved in the shadows, small at first, almost imperceptible, but growing clearer as it came closer. It wasn't the grotesque figure she had seen before, but something equally disturbing. A series of footprints forming on the gravel, as if something invisible was walking toward her. Grace let out a scream of terror and began to run, forgetting her exhaustion and pain. The road stretched on endlessly, but she couldn't stop. The sound of invisible footsteps was now beside her, keeping pace with her frantic escape. She tried to block it out, focusing only on moving forward. Finally, she saw a brighter light ahead. It was steadier and larger than the faint lamppost she had left behind. As she drew closer, she realized it was an abandoned gas station. The windows were shattered, and the sign hung precariously, but it still felt like a refuge, a place where she could hide. Grace ran to the building, pushing open the partially ajar glass door. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mold and rust. The shelves were empty, covered in dust and cobwebs, but at least it was shelter. She slumped against the wall, trying to catch her breath. The sound of the footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It was as if the world were holding its breath, waiting to strike. Then she heard something outside. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was lower but far more chilling, slow, deep breathing. Grace crawled to the window and peeked through the broken edge. At the edge of the station's light, she saw the figure again. It was larger than before, as if it had grown. Its disproportionate arms swung at its sides, and its eyes glowed like torches in the darkness. It stood still, just staring at the station, as though it knew she was inside. Grace pulled back from the window, trying not to make a sound. She gripped the knife again and looked around, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. There wasn't much, just broken pieces of wood and empty cans scattered on the floor. The sound of something scraping against the side of the building made her hold her breath. The creature was getting closer. Grace knew she didn't have much time. She needed to think fast or risk being trapped. Summoning her courage, she ran to the back of the station, where she found an exit door. It was a rusted metal door, but it seemed functional. She opened it cautiously, peering outside. There was no sign of the creature on that side. Maybe she could escape into the forest again. But before she could decide, the sound of breathing grew louder, now coming from the opposite side of the wall. It was too close. Grace knew her only option was to run once again, and that's exactly what she did. The night seemed darker as Grace ran back into the forest. The abandoned gas station faded into the distance, now just a distant speck in a landscape of despair. The trees grew denser here, forming narrow corridors that blocked the moonlight. The flashlight in her hand was her only guide, but its battery was failing, flickering occasionally. The sound of breathing, deep and steady, still followed her. She knew the creature was close, but it moved with calculated patience, as if toying with her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Grace tripped over a root and fell to her knees, letting out a muffled cry. The knife slipped from her hand into the damp earth. She grabbed it quickly, but the noise drew a new sound. It was as if something massive was crashing through the underbrush around her. Branches snapping and leaves crunching. "No, no, no," she whispered to herself, scrambling to her feet and running again, tears of desperation streaming down her face. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she saw nothing but shadows. Yet the sound continued, growing closer. She knew the creature was there, hidden, waiting. Her entire body was on high alert, her muscles aching from tension and exhaustion. After several minutes, Grace spotted a clearing ahead. A small stream ran silently through the open space, reflecting the moonlight. She thought about stopping to catch her breath, but knew she couldn't. Instead, she crossed the water, hoping the sound would muffle her footsteps and make it harder for her pursuer to track her. On the other side of the stream, she crouched behind a large fallen tree, trying to steady her breathing. The sound of the running water helped her focus, but the oppressive silence around her was unnerving. Where was the creature? Why hadn't it attacked yet? Grace remained still for a few minutes, listening intently. Then she heard it. Not footsteps, but a soft noise, almost like rustling. It was so faint it seemed to come from all directions at once. She turned her head slowly, trying to pinpoint its source, and then she saw something that made her heart nearly stop. At the edge of the clearing across the stream, two glowing eyes watched her. The creature was there, motionless, but clearly aware of her. Grace gripped the knife tightly, knowing she couldn't fight it. All she could do was run. But to her surprise, the creature didn't charge. Instead, it began to move slowly to the side, circling the clearing. It was as if it were trying to herd her back into the forest, guiding her somewhere. Grace realized this wasn't a typical attack. It was a hunting game. "You're playing with me," she murmured, terror swelling inside her. Grace knew she needed to think fast. Running without a plan would lead her straight into a trap. She scanned her surroundings for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on a cluster of large stones in the stream bed. Maybe she could use them to distract the creature. She picked up one of the rocks, gripping it tightly. Rising slowly to avoid drawing attention, she hurled the stone toward the opposite side of the clearing. The noise was loud enough to echo, shattering the oppressive silence. The creature paused, its glowing eyes blinking before it turned toward the sound. This was her chance. Grace bolted into the forest again, veering off into the denser trees. The branches clawed at her clothes and hair as if trying to hold her back. But she didn't stop. The sound of the creature crashing through the underbrush behind her grew louder, faster, more aggressive. As she ran, she saw something up ahead, a structure partially hidden by the trees. It looked like an old watchtower made of wood and iron, weathered by time. Grace knew it was a risk, but she had no other choice. She sprinted to the base of the tower and began climbing the rusty ladder. Each rung groaned under her weight, but she didn't stop. The sound of the creature grew louder, closer with every second. When she reached the top of the tower, she found herself on a small platform. There was an old broken radio and some remnants of camping gear scattered around. Grace leaned against the railing, gasping for air. She looked down and saw the creature at the base of the tower, its glowing eyes locked on her. It was larger than before, and the moonlight now illuminated its pale skin and elongated arms. Even from above, Grace could feel its oppressive presence. But to her surprise, the creature didn't climb. It just stood there, staring as if it knew she was cornered. Then she heard it again, that same guttural howl, but now much closer. Except this time, it wasn't coming from the creature. It came from the forest, from something deeper within. The creature recoiled, its glowing eyes fixed on the darkness. For the first time, Grace noticed something. The thing chasing her was also afraid. Something worse was coming. At the top of the tower, Grace felt the icy wind cutting across her face. What terrified her more than the creature at the base was the sound now dominating the forest. The deep, reverberating howl was much closer, as if something colossal was approaching, and even the monster that had been hunting her appeared visibly uneasy. The creature took a few awkward steps back, its long, gangly legs dragging along the ground. Its glowing eyes, once fixed on Grace, now turned toward the darkness of the forest. A low, rumbling sound, like the snapping of massive branches, echoed through the air. Grace clung tightly to the platform's railing, her knuckles white with fear. She was petrified, but couldn't look away from what was happening. The sound grew louder, closer. Suddenly something emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, even more terrifying than the creature that had chased her. Its silhouette was difficult to discern, but its monstrous form had twisted, root-like limbs, and eyes glowing red like smoldering embers. The air became thick with the pungent stench of damp earth and decay. Grace could barely breathe. The smaller creature, the one that had hunted her all night, now seemed tiny in the presence of this new horror. It backed away further, emitting a low, guttural growl. But the larger monster wasn't deterred. It stepped forward, and Grace saw with mounting dread that its body seemed to meld with the forest around it, as though it were an extension of the earth itself. The confrontation was swift and brutal. The smaller creature tried to fight back, but was crushed as if it were nothing. One powerful strike from the larger monster sent it collapsing to the ground, lifeless. Grace swallowed hard, trembling. If this thing could dispatch her hunter so easily, what would it do to her? The larger monster stood still for a moment, as if savoring its victory. Then, slowly, it lifted its head and looked directly at the tower. Its fiery red eyes pierced through Grace, as though it could see into her very soul. The terror was overwhelming. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The tower's platform was small, surrounded by rusted railings. There was no escape. The creature began to move toward her, each step reverberating like thunder. The tower's structure groaned under the weight of the tension, as if ready to collapse. Desperate, Grace scanned her surroundings for anything she could use. That's when she noticed the old radio. It was clearly broken, but its exposed wires and corroded battery gave her an idea. A crazy one. Perhaps she could create a short circuit, something to distract the creature, maybe even injure it. With trembling hands, she began tinkering with the radio, connecting the wires as best as she could. The sound of the creature's footsteps grew louder. She had no idea if her plan would work, but it was her only chance. As the creature reached the base of the tower, Grace managed to generate a spark. A small flash of light illuminated the platform momentarily, and she aimed the radio toward the edge of the tower, hoping to direct the makeshift shock. She didn't know if it would be enough, but she had no other options. The creature began climbing the tower, its massive hands gripping the rusted rungs with ease. Grace clutched the radio like a crude weapon, waiting for the right moment. When the monster's grotesque head appeared at the edge of the platform, she activated the device. A burst of light and sound filled the air. The creature recoiled, letting out a horrific scream that was a mix of pain and rage. The blast was strong enough to make it lose its grip, sending it plummeting to the ground with a thunderous crash that shook the earth. Grace looked down, gasping for air. The creature lay motionless on the ground, but it didn't look dead. She knew she only had a few minutes before it recovered. Without hesitation, she began descending the tower, skipping the last few rungs and landing hard on the ground. She took off running into the forest once more. Behind her, the creature's furious howl echoed through the trees, more enraged than ever. Grace knew she was in a race against time, but something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't just running away. She was fighting to survive. Grace ran like never before, her heart pounding in a frantic rhythm fueled by fear and adrenaline. The forest was an endless maze of branches and shadows, but she forced herself to keep going, even as her muscles screamed with exhaustion. Behind her, the guttural howl of the creature reverberated, a dark promise that the hunt was far from over. Her flashlight finally died, plunging her into complete darkness. Her only guide was the faint moonlight filtering through the treetops. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustling leaves, the snapping branches beneath her feet. Grace knew she couldn't keep running forever. She needed to find a place to hide, or something she could use to gain the upper hand. Then she saw it. Emerging from the shadows ahead was a stone structure in the middle of the forest. It looked like an old chapel or mausoleum, worn by time and partially covered in moss. The entrance was open, revealing an even deeper darkness inside. Grace hesitated for a moment, but the growing sound of footsteps behind her pushed her forward. The air inside the structure was heavy, smelling of mold and earth. Grace stumbled over something and nearly fell, but managed to steady herself, panting. She gripped her knife tightly and turned toward the entrance, expecting the creature to emerge from the shadows at any moment. The footsteps stopped. For a few seconds, everything was silent. Grace held her breath, straining to listen. Then the howl came again, louder and closer than ever. The creature was outside, waiting, as if it knew she had no escape. "Please, someone help me," she whispered, knowing she was alone. Suddenly, something inside the chapel caught her attention. A faint light began to glow at the back of the space. It was bluish, flickering like a flame, and seemed to emanate from an old stone altar. Grace felt her panic give way to a strange curiosity. She had no idea what it could be, but she knew she had to try. Carefully, she made her way toward the altar. There she found something unexpected, a strange metallic object in the shape of a circle engraved with unfamiliar symbols. The light seemed to pulse from within it, as though it were alive. Grace reached out, hesitating before touching the object. As her fingers made contact, a wave of heat surged through her body, filling her from the inside out. The fear she had felt moments ago was replaced by a sudden, overwhelming clarity. She didn't know how, but she understood this object was her only chance. With the object in hand, she returned to the chapel's entrance. Outside, the creature finally appeared. It was more monstrous than ever, its red eyes glowing like embers. Grace felt the instinct to run, but something inside her held her ground. She raised the object in front of her, aiming it at the creature. The monster lunged forward, but as it neared, the object's light flared brilliantly. A deafening sound filled the air, and the creature let out a horrifying scream. Its form began to writhe and contort, as if it were being torn apart from within. The blue light engulfed the monster, and within seconds it was reduced to ashes that scattered in the wind. Grace collapsed to her knees, exhausted. The object in her hand still glowed, though more faintly now. She looked around, expecting another threat, but the forest was silent. For the first time in hours, she felt safe. The path back seemed clearer now. The fear lingered, but Grace knew she had faced something far greater than she could have imagined, and won. Clutching the object, she began walking toward the road. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she would never be the same again.